We're in section 6.3, and our learning outcome is to explain the function of the white blood cells, the leukocytes, and some of their characteristics. And white blood cells, also called leukocytes, their role is to fight infection, and they're a really important part of the immune system. We would not be able to live in the world we live if we didn't have the ability to fight infections. And so here again is a normal blood smear, and it has all the red blood cells, and the arrows are pointing to white blood cells. When you stain blood, they want to show up the white blood cells because they're hard to see because they're white. So they have a stain that a lot of them are purple and pink and bluish. So and remember, there were like 5 different kinds of white blood cells. So this white blood cell looks a lot different than this one. And there's a couple different kinds shown here. So these are the white blood cells. They are, some of them are phagocytes, and some of them make antibodies. So there's lots of different kinds, and I'm going to mention what that means. But notice that there's a lot fewer white blood cells than red blood cells. The proportion of white blood cells is a lot lower. So we're going to I'm going to tell you about phagocytes and antibodies. But before I do that, I wanted to just remind you that we have these stem cells in the bone marrow, and when they divide, they form these different cells. They ultimately produce 5 different kinds of white blood cells. In our class, you don't need to know all the different types of white blood cells, but in a more advanced class, you will be learning that in A&P and all that. So, and a couple of these cells, if you look at them, they say they're related to becoming, they're referenced to becoming phagocyte, and these are phagocytes. So that's a term I want you to know. And so what are phagocytes, and what are antibodies, and how do they fight infection? So like I said, a couple of the kinds of white blood cells are phagocytes, and what that means is they can carry out phagocytosis. The PHAG, or phage, means to eat. So the phagocyte, or phagocytosis, is when a white blood cell, so this blue cell right here is a white blood cell, and it's going to eat a bacterial cell or even a virus, but some invading cell. Actually, phagocytes even eat those broken up pieces of red blood cells when they die. So anything foreign or anything abnormal, white blood cells, the phagocytes, can surround these abnormal pieces or these invading pathogens and surround them, and then what it's showing you here is it kind of digests them and throws the parts out. So a phagocyte is a white blood cell that can carry out phagocytosis, and it's going to remove pathogens like bacteria and viruses, as well as any old or damaged cells of the host. So our own phagocytes can eat up our own dead cells that are floating around in our blood. Now and that's a really important part of keeping our blood clean and free of pathogens. So that's an important defense mechanism. Some of our white blood cells can make antibodies. So antibodies are proteins. And so here's this Y-shaped molecule that's an antibody. It's made by certain white blood cells. And antibodies recognize antigens. What they're showing you in this picture is if this is a pathogen, let's say this is a bacterial cell that's floating around in the blood. That bacterial cell has markers on it. It has proteins on the surface that identify it as a bacterial cell. Our immune system recognizes this is not my own cell. This is a foreign cell, because these antigens, these molecules on the surface of the bacterial cell, are different than our own cells. These are foreign, and they trigger the production of antibodies. In fact, the word antigen means antibody generator. So let me just reiterate. Some white blood cells, when they're exposed to a pathogen, like a bacterial cell, start making antibodies that stick to the antigens on the bacterial cell. So the antibodies stick to the antigens, and notice that they match. That matches up. A different kind of antibody would have to be made against these antigens. So antibodies are really specific. They're going to respond to a very specific kind of pathogen and try to remove it from the body. So 2 ways white blood cells can help our body defend against pathogen is some cells are phagocytes. They engulf bacterial cells, and some cells make antibodies against the pathogen, and they respond to the antigens on that pathogen. Okay, so a disease related to the white blood cells is leukemia. And we've all heard of leukemia. And so when you get that emia in biology, when you use this suffix emia, it means a high number. So leuc refers to white, so the white blood cells, and there's a high number. And so leukemia is a cancer where there's too many white blood cells. The white blood cells are multiplying out of control. So here's a slide of blood from somebody who has leukemia. And these blue or purplish cells are the white blood cells. Now, let me just go back and remind you what normal blood looks like. We've got some of these white blood cells, but there's a lot more red cells. When someone has leukemia, they can have way more white cells. The other thing is these white cells look kind of weird. When you look at those compared to these white cells look a lot different than these. So when somebody has leukemia, they not only have a lot of white blood cells, an abnormally large number, but they also are not normal. So most of the white blood cells are abnormal, so they don't function well. You'd think if, you have a lot of white blood cells, you can fight infections really well. But in leukemia, you have so many white blood cells, but they're not healthy. They're not normal, so you don't fight infections well. So in fact, one of the reasons why, one of the signs that somebody has leukemia is they keep getting infections. They're not fighting infections well. There's another thing that happens with leukemia. People with leukemia often have extreme fatigue and problems with blood clotting. Why? So let's go back to the extreme fatigue. Remember the disease we said if you have extreme fatigue, you could have anemia, meaning you're not making enough red blood cells. So we go back to this picture where we have the stem cells in the bone marrow, and let's say this patient has leukemia. They're making way too many of a certain kind of white blood cells. You only have a certain number of stem cells dividing at a given time. So you're making all your different kinds of blood cells out of the same stem cells. If you make way too many of this certain kind of white blood cell, you're not going to have enough stem cells to make enough red blood cells or platelets. If you have not enough red blood cells, you can have anemia. You can have, you're going to have low oxygen carrying capacity. And so a lot of times when somebody has leukemia, they get a lot of infections, and they also are really tired because they have anemia. When we get to platelets, we're going to talk about how platelets are involved in blood clotting. So again, you have too many white cells, you're going to have not enough platelets, not enough red cells. So you're not going to clot your blood very well. So this blood, even look at that. There's relatively low numbers of red cells compared to the white cells. So that person could also have anemia. So when you have leukemia, the patient goes to the doctor because they're tired. They might not be clotting blood well. They're getting a lot of infections, and they find out the patient has leukemia. Okay, so explain the relationship between leukemia and white cells.